The Acknowledgments and Preface to No One Left to Lie to, The Triangulations of William Jefferson Clinton by Christopher Hitchens. Acknowledgments. Thanks are due to all those on the left who saw the menace of Clinton and who resisted the moral and political blackmail which silenced and shamed the liberal herd. I should like to thank Perry Anderson, Mark Cooper, Patrick Cadell, Doug Ireland, Bruce Shapiro, Barbara Ehrenreich, Gwendolyn Mink, Sam Husseini for his special help on the healthcare racket, Robin Blackburn, Roger Morris, Joseph Heller, and Jemin Raskin. Many honorable conservative friends also deserve my thanks for repudiating Clintonism, even when it served their immediate, and I would say, exorbitant political needs. They might prefer not to be thanked by name. The experience of beginning such an essay in a state of relative composure, and then finishing it amid the collapsing scenery of a show trial and an unfolding scandal of multinational proportions, only hinted at here, was a vertiginous one. I could not have attempted it or undergone it without Carol Blue, whose instinct for justice and whose contempt for falsity has been my loving insurance for a decade. Christopher Hitchens, Washington, D.C., March 1999. Preface. This little book has no hidden agenda. It is offered in the most cheerful and open polemical spirit, as an attack on a crooked president and a corrupt and reactionary administration. Necessarily, it also engages with the stratagems that have been employed to shield that president and that administration, and it maintains, even insists, that the two most salient elements of Clintonism, the personal crookery on the one hand, and the cowardice and conservatism on the other, are indissolubly related. I have found it frankly astonishing and sometimes alarming, not just since January of 1998, but since January of 1992, to encounter the dust storm of bogus arguments that face anyone prepared to make such a simple case. A brief explanation, by no means to be mistaken for an apologia, may be helpful. Some years ago I was approached, as were my editors at Vanity Fair, by a woman claiming to be the mother of a child by Clinton. I decline to use the word illegitimate as a description of a baby, and may as well say at once that this is not my only difference with a supposedly moral majority, or indeed with any other congregation or the mot juste flock. The woman seemed superficially convincing. The attached photographs had an almost off-putting resemblance to the putative father. The child was, if only by the rightly discredited test of Plessy versus Ferguson, black. The mother had, at the time of his conception, been reduced to selling her body for money. We had a little editorial conference about it. Did Hitchens want to go to Australia, where the woman then was? Well, Hitchens had always wanted to go to Australia, but here are the reasons why I turned down such a tempting increment on my frequent flyer mileage program. First of all, and even assuming the truth of the story, the little boy had been conceived when Mr. Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. At that time, the bold governor had not begun his highly popular campaign against defenseless indigent mothers, nor had he emerged as the upright scourge of the deadbeat dad or absent father. The woman, perhaps because she had African genes and worked as a prostitute, had not been rewarded with a state job, even of the lowly kind bestowed on Gennifer Flowers. There seemed, in other words, to be no political irony or contradiction of the sort that sometimes licenses a righteous press in the exposure of iniquity. There was further the question of Mrs. and Miss Clinton. If Hillary Clinton, hardened as she doubtless was, I would now say, as she undoubtedly is, was going to find that she had a sudden stepdaughter, that might perhaps be one thing. But Chelsea Clinton was then aged about 12. An unexpected black half-brother, quite close to her own age, might have been just the right surprise for her. On the other hand, it might not. I didn't feel it was my job to decide this. My friends Graydon Carter and Elise O'Shaughnessy, I'm pleased to say, were in complete agreement. A great story in one way, but also a story we would always have regretted breaking. Even when I did go to Australia for the magazine, some time later, I took care to leave the woman's accusing dossier behind. Like a number of other people in Washington, I had heard a third-hand version of her tale during the election of 1992. In the briefly famous documentary The War Room, which hymns the spinning skills of thugs like James Carville, George Stephanopoulos can be seen live on the telephone, deftly fending off a nutcase Ross Perot supporter who has called in about the bastard. The caller may not have said black bastard, but one didn't have to be unduly tender-minded to notice that Clinton, however much he had tried to charm and woo them, still had enemies on the right. Some of these enemies had allowed themselves to become infected, or were infected already, with the filthy taint of racism. That seemed an additional reason for maintaining a certain reserve. I wasn't to know that, by the middle of 1998, Clinton's hacks would be using the bigotry of some of his critics in the same way that Johnny Cochran had employed the sick racist cop Mark Furman to change the subject and to whiten the sepulchre. Just as the Republican case against the president seemed to be lapsing into incoherence in the first days of 1999, Matt Drudge uncorked the black baby again. Indeed, he curtain-raised this non-exclusive at the annual gathering of the cultural and political right held in San Diego as a rival attraction to the pulverizing tedium and self-regard of the Clintonian Renaissance weekend at Hilton Head. Once put to the most perfunctory forensic tests, the whole story collapsed within the space of 24 hours. Mr. Clinton's DNA, famously found dabbled on the costly Gap garment of a credulous intern, was sufficiently knowable from the indices of the Star report for a preliminary finding to be possible. There was nothing like a match between the two genetic attributes. Once again, and for reasons of professional rather than political feeling, I felt glad that Graydon Carter and I had put privacy and scruples that arose partly from the fatherhood of our own daughters ahead of sensation all those years ago. Still, I couldn't help but notice that White House spokesmen, when bluntly asked about the Drudge story by reporters, reacted as if it could be true. There was nothing about their leader they seemed to convey by the attenuated remains of their body language that might not one day need a privacy defense, however hastily or wildly concocted. It turned out, however, that Mr. Drudge had done them another unintended favor. Nothing is more helpful to a person with a record of economizing with the truth than a false and malicious and disprovable allegation. And Drudge, whose want of discrimination in this respect is almost a trademark, openly says he'll print anything and let the customers decide what's actually kosher. This form of pretended consumer sovereignty is fraudulent in the same way that its analogues are. It means, for one thing, that you have no right to claim that you were correct or truthful or brave. All you did was pass it on, like a leaker or some other kind of conduit. The death of any intelligent or principled journalism is foreshadowed by such promiscuity. In the old days, true enough, the Washington Press Corps was a megaphone for official sources. Now it's a megaphone for official sources and traders from the toilet. Just such a symbiosis, comparable to his affectless equidistance between left and right, Republican and Democrat, white-collar crime and blue-collar crime, true and false, sacred and profane, bought and paid for, public and private, quid and quo, happened to serve Mr. Clinton well on the day in January 1998 that his presidency went into eclipse, or seemed about to do so. He made the most ample possible use of the natural reticence and decency that is felt by people who open a bedroom or bathroom door without knocking, and this even though he was the occupant of said bathroom and bedroom. He also made a masterly use of the apparent contrast between the trivial and the serious. But on this occasion, and having watched it for some years, I felt confident that I could see through his shell game. On the first day, and in the presence of witnesses, I said, "This time he's going to be impeached." And in support of my own much underrated and even mocked prescience, I will quote what the Los Angeles Times was kind enough to print under my name on January 28, 1998. Quote, Montesquieu remarked that if a great city or a great state should fall as the result of an apparent accident, then there would be a general reason why it required only an accident to make it fall. This may appear to be a tautology, but it actually holds up very well as a means of analyzing what we lazily refer to as a sex scandal. If a rust-free zipper were enough on its own to cripple a politician, then quite clearly Bill Clinton would be remembered, if at all, as a mediocre governor of the great state of Arkansas. It is therefore silly to describe the present unseemly furor as a prurient outburst over one man's apparently self-destructive sexual compulsions. Until recently, this same man was fairly successfully fighting a delaying action against two long-standing complaints. The first was that he had imported unsavory Arkansas business practices to Washington, along with some of the unsavory practitioners, like the disgraced Webster Hubbell. The second was that he viewed stray women, employees, as spoils along the trail. Think of these two strands as wires, neither of them especially alive. Everybody knew something about both, and few people believed that there was no substance to either story, but a fairly general benefit of the doubt was still being awarded. Now the two wires have touched and crossed and crackled. Vernon Jordan's fellow board members at Revlon gave a suspiciously large consultancy contract to Hubbell at just the moment when his usefulness as anybody's attorney had come to an end. He was, after all, not just quitting the Department of Justice, but going straight to jail. And now, this same well of Revlon is revisited by the busy Mr. Jordan when it comes time to furnish Monica Lewinsky with a soft landing. So does this represent a Clinton machine modus operandi when it comes to potentially embarrassing witnesses? Kenneth Starr would be failing in his mandate as independent counsel if he did not put the question and press hard for an answer. Even more to the point, so would we. This was all waiting to happen. Or consider Dick Morris, Clinton's other best friend. The tarts from the escort service we could have, with a slight shudder, overlooked. But Morrison's carryings-on in the Jefferson Hotel were an allegory of the way business was being conducted at the Democratic National Committee and even in the franchising of the Lincoln bedroom. His exorbitant political bills necessitated the debauching not just of himself, but of a whole presidential election. So that dirty little story served to illuminate the dirty big story, as does this one. Had Clinton begun by saying, "Yes, I did love Jennifer, but that's my business," many of us would have rejoiced and defended him. Instead, he disowned and insulted her and said he'd been innocent of that adultery, and treated the voters as if they were saps. Having apparently put Ms. Lewinsky into the quick-fix world of Jordan and Morris, he is in no position to claim that it's a private emotional matter, and has no right to confuse his business with that of the country's, which is why he has a scandal on his hands, and is also why we need feel no pang when he falsely claims that the press and public are wasting his valuable time, when the truth is exactly the other way about. End quote. I sat back after writing that, and sat back rather pleased with myself after reading it in print, and thought that some people would take my point even if they didn't agree with it. And then went through a year in which, not once but several times, every day, I was informed that Clinton had lied only to protect his wife and daughter, and himself, from shame. In the course of that same year, his wife and daughter were exposed by Clinton to repeated shame and humiliation. Dick Morris emerged as the only person to whom Clinton told the truth. Vernon Jordan emerged as the crucial witness in a matter of obstruction of justice. "Notice how they always trash the accusers," said Eric Tarloff to me one day. Eric, who has contributed to speeches for Clinton and Gore, and is married to Laura DeAndrea Tyson, former chair of Clinton's Council of Economic Advisers. "They destroy their reputations. If Monica hadn't had that blue dress, they were getting ready to portray her as a fantasist and an erotomaniac. Imagine what we'd all be thinking of her now." Nor was this an exaggeration. In parallel with its Robert Reuben Allen Greenspan presentation of bankerly orthodoxy and unshakable respectability, the Clinton administration always had its banana republic side. For all the talk about historic presidential philandering, it is hard to recall any other White House which has had to maintain a quasi-governmental or parastate division devoted exclusively to the bullying and defamation of women. Like my old friend, there were many who didn't like to think about it. Even Clinton's best friend, the notably unfastidious Dick Morris, once told CNBC, quote, "Under Betsy Wright's supervision in the 1992 Clinton campaign, there was an entire operation funded with over $100,000 of campaign money, which included federal matching funds, to hire private detectives to go into the personal lives of women who were alleged to have had sex with Bill Clinton, to develop compromising material, blackmailing information, basically, to coerce them into signing affidavits saying they did not have sex with Bill Clinton." End quote. Having sex was the most fragrant and presentable way of describing the experience of certain women, like the Arkansas nursing home supervisor Juanita Broderick, who was raped by Clinton while he was State Attorney General in 1978. See Chapter 6. Even as the 1999 impeachment trial was in progress, NBC was withholding a long interview with this extremely credible and principled lady, whose affidavit sat in the evidence room at the House of Representatives. No Democrat ever went to look at the evidence, and this was not because of its presumed untruth. By then, the use of the mantra consensual sex had become part of consensual or consensus politics, and women who told the truth were accused, at best, of trying to lure a sitting president into a perjury trap, as if it were necessary to trick Clinton into telling a lie. Of course, in a time of sexual McCarthyism, there's probably some advantage in being prudent. Take this little item, which appeared deadpan on page A10 of the Washington Post on January 30th, 1999. It concerned the testimony of an investigator who had been hired to keep an eye on Mrs. Kathleen Willey. Ms. Willey, some may recall, had been an admirer of President Clinton, had been the wife of a Democratic fundraiser, had been a volunteer worker at the White House, had suddenly become a widow, had gone in distress to the Oval Office for comfort and for a discussion about the possibility of a paying job, and had been rewarded with a crushing embrace, some cliched words of barroom courtship, and the guiding by the presidential mitt of her own hand onto his distended penis. That is, if you believe her story, it could all have been channeled into her mind by the Christian Coalition or the Aryan nations, who then manipulated the staunch Democratic liberal into confessing her embarrassment on 60 Minutes. Whatever the truth of her story, and smoking guns should perhaps not be mentioned right away, she found her life altered once she had gone public. Her car tires ruined, her cat gone missing, some unexpected attention from a major Clinton fundraising crony named Nathan Landau. Nothing you could quite put a name to. As the Washington Post unsensationally put it, quote, Jarrett Stern, a private investigator, told ABC News in an interview broadcast last night that he was hired for an unspecified project by Landau, a wealthy Maryland developer who has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Clinton-Gore campaigns. Stern's lawyer, Edouard Bouquet of Bethesda, told the network his client felt uneasy about what he was asked to do and called Willey, using an alias, to warn her someone was out to do her harm. Stern declined to detail what he had been asked to do in connection with Willey, but he told ABC that he wholeheartedly believes that Willey was approached with a menacing message by a stranger jogging near her Richmond home 2 days before her, Paula Jones' case testimony. Willey has said the man inquired about her children by name, about her missing cat, and about whether she'd gotten the tires on her car repaired after they were mysteriously vandalized by someone who drove masses of nails into all 4 of them. Don't you get the message? She has said, the man asked. End quote. I.F. Stone once observed that the Washington Post was a great newspaper because you never knew what page you would find the page 1 story on. This tale made page 10 on the Saturday before the United States Senate called its first witness. Let us imagine and even believe that Ms. Willey and Monsieur Bouquet and Mr. Stern all conspired to tell a lie. You will still have to notice that it is they, lacking state power, or police power, or public opinion power if it comes to that, who are the sexual McCarthyites. They are McCarthyites by virtue of having made an allegation. The potential culprits, Mr. Landau, or the most powerful man in the world for whom he has raised untold money, are the hapless victims. The charge of McCarthyism aimed at Ms. Willey and her unexpected corroborators could easily have been avoided. They could, after all, have kept quiet. And I almost wish that they had, because I then would not have been told by Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and many others that it was Clinton who dared not move outside, or even inside his secure executive mansion, for fear of the female stalkers and lynchers and inquisitors who dogged his every step. And outlets like The Nation would not have dishonored the memory of McCarthy's victims, many of them men and women of principle, who were persecuted for their principles and not for their deeds, by comparing their experience to the contemptible evasions of a cheap crook. Mr. Nate Landau also tried to follow the McCarthyite script as much as it lay within his power. Confronted with questions about his leaning on an inconvenient and vulnerable witness, he eagerly sought the protection of the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. This and other legal stratagems were not strange to him. Note what Dick Morris said earlier, that when Clinton is in trouble, he resorts to the world of soft money for allies. It is this fact alone that destroys his claim to privacy and ties together his public affluence and private squalor. Nathan Landau is the personification of that shady and manipulative world. He paid a small fortune to have Kathleen Willey flown by private jet from Richmond to his mansion on Maryland's eastern shore, where he pressed her about her depositions in the Paula Jones case. His fundraising organization, IMPAC, was and remains a core group in the money primary to which Democratic aspirants must submit. He himself probably prefers Gore to Clinton. In 1996, he provided a microcosm of the soft money world in action. The Cheyenne Arapaho peoples of Oklahoma have been attempting for years to regain land that was illegally seized from them by the federal government in 1869. Democratic Party fundraisers persuaded the tribes that an ideal means of gaining attention would be to donate $107,000 to the Clinton-Gore campaign. This contribution secured them a small place at a large lunch with other Clinton donors, but no action. According to the Washington Post, a Democratic political operative named Mitchell Copperthite then petitioned Landau to take up their cause. Landau first required them to register with the consulting firm of Peter Knight, who is Al Gore's chief money man and promoter, for a $100,000 retainer and a fee of $10,000 per month. Then he demanded that the Cheyenne Arapaho sign a development deal with him, handing over 10% of all income produced on the recovered land, including the revenues from oil and gas. When news of this nasty deal, which was rejected by the tribes, became public, the Democratic National Committee was forced to return the money, and the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs issued a report describing the fleecing of the Indians by a series of Democratic operators who attempted to pick their pockets for legal fees, land development, and additional contributions. These are the sort of Democratic operators to whom Clinton turns when he needs someone to take care of business. And of course, Mr. Landau's daughter works at the White House, causing nobody to ask how she got her job. In Clinton's Washington, there is always affirmative action for such people. In the same week as the Landau-Willey revelations, the Court of Appeals decisively reinstated Judge Kenneth Starr's case against Webster Hubbell, his wife, and their 2 advisors for tax evasion. It might be said, probably was said, that when it comes to lying about taxes, everybody does it. However, Mr. Hubbell's seeming motive in concealing a large tranche of income was not the wish to enjoy its fruits while free of tax. It was, how can one phrase this without sounding like the frightful Inspector Javert? Because he would have had difficulty explaining how he came by the money in the first place. The money, to which I had tried to call attention in my Los Angeles Times article a year previously, had been given to him by Revlon and other normally tight-fisted corporations, not unconnected to the soft money universe inhabited by Clinton. In their reinstatement of the suit, the majority on the Court of Appeals used the dread phrase hush money in a rather suggestive, albeit prima facie, manner. Many past presidents have appointed sordid underlings at the Department of Justice. One thinks of Bobby Kennedy, one thinks of Ed Meese, This time, however, almost nobody came forward to say that they all do it. Perhaps this alibi had become subject, after a grueling workout, to a law that nobody can break with impunity, the law of diminishing returns. There was no sex involved, so Judge Starr was spared the routine yells about his pornographic and prurient obsessions. I continued to chant the slogan I had minted a year previously. It's not the lipstick traces, stupid. It's the Revlon connection. Something like this may have occurred to Senator Russell Feingold of Wisconsin, when, only 2 days later on January 28th, he cast the only Democratic vote against dismissing the charges, and also the only Democratic vote in favor of calling witnesses to the Senate. One says Democratic vote, though in point of fact, Senator Feingold is the only member of the Senate who is entitled to call himself an independent. In the elections of November 1998, he submitted himself for re-election, having announced that he would accept no soft money donations. This brave decision, which almost cost him his seat, rallied many Wisconsin voters who had been raised in the grand tradition of La Follette's Midwestern populism, a populism of trust-busting rather than crowd-pleasing. His later Senate vote on impeachment, which represented the misgivings of at least 5 other senators who were more prudent as well as more susceptible to party discipline, forever negates the unending Clintonoid propaganda about a vast right-wing conspiracy, and also shames all those who were browbeaten into complicity, turned to stone by the waving of Medusa's heads like Lot and Gingrich, and too slow to realize that such gorgons were in fact Clinton's once and future allies, not his nemesis. I began this prologue by disclaiming any hidden agenda, but I think I might as well proclaim the open one. For more than a year I watched people develop and circulate the most vulgar imaginable conspiracy theories, most of them directed at the work of an independent counsel, and all of them part-generated with public funds by a White House that shamelessly and simultaneously whined about its need to resume public business. I heard and saw the most damaging and defamatory muck being readied for the heads and shoulders of women who told, or might consider telling, the plain truth. I observed in some quite tasteful Washington surroundings the incubation of sheer paranoia and rumor-mongering, most especially the ludicrous claim that Mr. Clinton's departure would lead, had no one read the Constitution, to the ascension of Bob Barr or Pat Robertson to the White House. I also saw, rather satisfyingly, the same Mr. Robertson, and later all the fundraisers of the Republican Party assembled in conclave in Palm Beach, Florida, as they beseeched the Congressional Party to leave Mr. Clinton alone and, in general, to get with the program. Not even this consolation, however, could make up for the pro-Clinton and anti-impeachment rally that took place in Washington on December 17, 1998. On that day, as nameless Iraqis died to make a Clinton holiday, and as the most pathetic lies were emitted from the White House, Jesse Jackson and other members of the stage army of liberalism were gathered on the Capitol steps to wave banners and shout slogans in defense of Clinton's integrity and, yes, privacy. "A camera in every bedroom," said one witless placard, perhaps confusing the off-the-record surveillance conducted by the White House with the on-the-record legal investigation to which Clinton had promised his full cooperation. As the news of the bombing arrived and sank in, the poor fools had an impromptu discussion about whether to proceed with their pointless rally or to adjourn it. they went ahead. It is the argument of all these ensuing pages that the public and private faces of Clintonism are the same, as was proved on that awful day and on so many others. It is the hope of these pages also that some of the honor of the left can be rescued from the moral and intellectual shambles of the past 7 years, in which the locusts have dined so long and so well. Among the many occasions on which he telegraphed his personal and political character to the wider world, Clinton's speech at the funeral of Richard Nixon in April 1994 was salient. Speaking as he did after a fatuous harangue from Billy Graham, a piece of self-promoting sanctimony from Henry Kissinger, and a lachrymose performance from Robert Dole, Clinton seemed determined nonetheless to match their standard. There was fatuity in plenty. Nixon would not allow America to quit the world. There was mawkishness and falsity to spare. From these humble roots grew the force of a driving dream. There was one useful, if alarming, revelation. Even in the final weeks of his life, he gave me his wise counsel, especially in regard to Russia. One likes to picture Clinton getting pro-Yeltsin phone calls from the old maestro who always guessed the Russians wrong, and who also initiated the ongoing romance between Chinese Stalinism and United States multinational corporations. Perhaps that's what the calls were really about. However, toward the close of this boilerplated and Pharisaic homily, Clinton gave one hostage to fortune, which I scribbled down at the time. Today is a day for his family, his friends, and his nation to remember President Nixon's life in totality. To them let me say, may the day of judging President Nixon on anything less than his entire life and career come to a close. How devoutly I wished that this prayer might be answered. The foul-mouthed anti-Semitism in the Oval Office, along with the murder of Allende, the hush money, and the mafia conversations, along with the aerial destruction of Indochina, the utter sexlessness, along with the incurably dirty mind, the sense of incredulity and self-pity that rose to a shriek when even the least of his offenses was unearthed. I wrote down Clinton's sanctimonious words, because I was sure that I would need them one day. Thank you for listening.